Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We're going to give it just a moment before we go ahead and get started. Hope everyone's having a great day. Okay, thank you all for joining us. We're going to give it just another minute before we get started. All righty. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Today's webinar is on gene therapy, global seroprevalence for pre-existing immunity against AAV5 and other AAV serotypes in people with hemophilia A. My name is Alison Murtha, and I'm the Strategic Communications Manager here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. At any point during the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us from one of our live streaming platforms, you can go ahead and throw your comment and question into the comments. We'll make sure to pull them. We have NHS staff members monitoring these questions, which we will post to our speaker after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning on Friday, October 28th. So I am joined today by Dr. Robert Klamroth. I tried. He's joining us all the way from Berlin, which is such a privilege and honor to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We're going to turn it over to you to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to give this presentation about gene therapy and global seroprevalence of pre-existing immunity against AAV5 and other AAV serotypes in people with hemophilia A. So I'm the director of the Hemophilia Treatment Center in Berlin, in Germany. And first of all, I show my disclosures. So there's a lot of collaboration with different companies who are working in hemostasis and hemophilia. It's mainly due to giving presentations and doing research. I would like to provide some context before we go into the study. I don't know how familiar but you are with gene therapy, but I think most of you heard about gene therapy. And one task in gene therapy is to get the gene into the liver where the production of the missing clotting factor take place after gene therapy. And there are some ideas how we can put or transfer the gene into the hepatocyte in the liver. And there are non-viral ways, which were not very successful so far because the expression of the missing clotting factor was very short. And so at the moment, most gene therapies are using viruses. Viruses where you put the correct gene into the virus to get expression of factor 8 in hemophilia A or factor 9 in hemophilia B. And there were several viruses in clinical trials, and all gene therapy studies at the moment who are close to the license. So the gene therapy for hemophilia A in the European Union was just licensed in summer this year and is already available in Germany for patients on a regular basis. They are using AAV, adeno-associated viruses. And the advantage of these viruses is that the probability of getting cancer is quite low, the immunogenicity is low, and there's no genome integration, which is much more risky with retroviruses and lentiviruses. There's integration in the own host gain, and so there's a risk of developing cancer. And in some studies with retroviruses and lentiviruses, there are cancer cases. The disadvantages of AAV viruses, they have a quite low capacity. So the gene for hemophilia B is quite well fit in this gene. For hemophilia A, it's a little bit more difficult. And in general how we do AAV gene transfer. So we use the gutless capsid, remove the AAV genome, and put in this vector the promoter and the therapeutic gene. In case of hemophilia A, it's a factor 8 gene. In case of hemophilia B, it's a factor 9 gene. And then it's one infusion intravenously over 2 to 3 hours. And the vector, the virus, finds its way into the liver, goes into the hepatocyte, then into the nucleus of the hepatocyte, is episomal next to the host DNA, and there's a production of the factor protein, in this case, factor 8 or factor 9. And we have a lot of different AAV serotypes. Remember, AAV serotypes are wild-type viruses who need for an infection a helper virus, like herpes or an adenovirus, and that is the reason these viruses are called adeno-associated viruses. And you see, most of these viruses go into the liver, but they use some other cells too, and they have a quite high expression levels. And different gene therapy trials are using different AAV vectors. And of course, because people with hemophilia or normal people could have an infection in the past with these AAV viruses, there might be antibodies existing against these viruses, like with other viral infections, where you develop after the viral infections antibodies against the viruses. And for gene therapy, of course, it's very important to know if there are any antibodies against these viruses. And for the gene therapy trials, we have AAV2 viruses, AAV5 viruses, and AAV8. Why it's so important if there are antibodies or no antibodies? Normally, if there are no AAV antibodies, there was no infection in the past with AAV, we have a successful transduction of the gene into the liver cell and a production of the transgene factor 8 or factor 9. If there are AAV antibodies present, then these antibodies bind to the virus, to the vector, and there's insufficient, inefficient, or poor transduction, and little or no transgene product produced. And all studies in hemophilia A only included patients who were negative, where no AAV antibodies were present. Of course, it's interesting to know how many people with hemophilia have antibodies against AAV, because all patients with antibodies are not eligible for gene therapy at the moment, because gene therapy would be inefficient and not working in these patients, because the antibodies will, easily say, it will kill all the vectors, and no transduction or poor transduction is possible, and we will have no factor expression. And that was the reason to do a global seroprevalence study of pre-existing immunity, maybe antibodies, neutralizing antibodies against different AAV serotypes in people with hemophilia. And the study design was a prospective, non-interventional study where we looked for this seroprevalence of antibodies and neutralizing factor against AAV. There were 9 countries: Brazil, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, South Africa, UK, and the US. And on day 1, participants visited the clinic for the collection plasma or serum, and there was in approximately 20% of patients a recollection at 3 or 6 months to see if there's a change over time in these antibodies and in the antibody titer. And the participants in this study were only patients with hemophilia A above 12 years, all with a residual factor 8 level below 2%, so mostly severe patients. All of them had the previous treatment with factor 8, prophylaxis or on demand. And of course, concerning these antibodies, there was no difference between patients with or without factor 8 inhibitors. And these antibodies against AAV5 were measured with a validated bridging total antibody ECLSA, which is quite complicated. And there was only one laboratory in the US where all these AAV antibodies were measured, and AAV5, which is at the moment, AAV5 is a virus and the vector for the biomarine factor VIII gene therapy and for the hemophilia B unicure CSL gene therapy. So at the moment, the most advanced vector which is used in gene therapy. Titers of confirmed positive samples were measured by serial dilution, and there was an assay validation and sample testing at ARUP laboratories, Salt Lake City in Utah, and that was the main laboratory for the clinical trial, and it's for the clinical setting. We do this antibody testing in this laboratory too, and there's now a second laboratory in Germany, in Berlin, which can perform with the same accuracy this antibody test against AAV5. So here are the participants. You can see different age group. Age at enrollment was 36 years. There was a proportion from patients from 12 to 18, and it was all age groups were represented. There were maybe a few patients above 60 years, but most of them were adults, different race, nearly all male patients. They had quite for a long time hemophilia. A lot of them with a history to hepatitis B or hepatitis C. Most patients on a prophylactic treatment. And you see here the different numbers. Brazil, France, and Germany were 90 patients. They were mostly from my center, and you see the goal was to include 90 patients. Maybe you can see already here that there was a very low number of patients included in the UK. So the results from the UK are not representative in contrast to other countries where we had a broader inclusion. And if we look now at the overall AAV seropositivity for patients in the study, you can see that over all these 9 countries, that there was a difference between the serotypes, and AAV2, nearly 60% had existing antibodies against AAV2. In contrast, in AAV5, this was only 35%, so that it was the lowest global seroprevalence in comparison to all other AAV vectors. So that's first a good sign, because I told you in the beginning, if you have antibodies against the vector, the probability that gene therapy works is much lower. If we look now for age, you can see here that over the years, the titer is going up a little bit. And again, AAV5 again was the lowest proportion. It's the blue with the circles is antibodies against AAV5. And you see here that there's slightly an increase from 30% to about 30% with a broader age. And this is true for all serotypes. So with a higher age, the probability of AAV seropositivity is higher. If you look now at the variability between different countries, you can see here that the prevalence of pre-existing countries, it's quite different. And first for AAV2, you see that in some countries like South Africa, there's a very high seroprevalence against AAV2. Japan, Italy, Germany, it's quite low. In the US, it's about 50%. If you look now for AAV5, it's an antibody which is AAV5, that is a vector which is momentarily used in the most advanced gene therapy, like the gene therapy from biomarine for hemophilia A. You see quite a lower prevalence. In Germany, it's about 30%. In the US, it's in the same range. And I told you already, the UK with only 17 patients is not a valid result for comparison. But again, it's quite clear that if you have a higher seroprevalence in a certain country, like South Africa, then the seroprevalence for all serotypes, AAV2, AAV8, AAV recombinant 10 is quite high. And if you have a low seroprevalence, then it's mainly in all countries that the seroprevalence is quite low. And there's at least some cross-reactivity in patients who are positive against all serotypes. Still, it's important to recognize that independent from the geographic area, the seroprevalence of antibodies against AAV5 is the lowest. If you look at the antibody titer is important from this point of view. With a higher antibody titer, of course, there's a more destruction if you use this AAV virus as a vector. And again, you can see the advantage of AAV5, where the antibody titer is quite low. And that at least keeps this in mind, because if you have a positive patient with a high antibody titer, the probability that gene therapy will work is very low. If you have an antibody with a low titer, even with if some antibody is present, gene therapy might work if the inactivation of the vector is in the lower end. And for AAV5, at least in hemophilia B, there was a study where it's shown that even with low and middle titers of antibodies against AAV, gene therapy can be successful. In hemophilia A, you still need a negative test against AAV vectors, because patients with seropositivity were excluded. If we look now over time, is there a change in the antibody titers in patients who had a second test after 3 and after 6 months? You can see that's quite consistent. So there's not a big difference. Keep in mind, it's better to compare day 1 and month 6, because there was a higher number of patients who were retested after 6 months. And I think it's pretty stable. In the beginning, you saw there's a slight correlation between seropositivity and age, but in 6 months, there's no big change in patients about seropositivity, so no many conversions. Second question is there a difference in titer? And again, you see here that the very low titers, antibody titers in AAV5 are persistent over 6 months. That has implications, because if you do gene therapy in patients with hemophilia A, you need a negative antibody test against AAV5. And from my point of view, we can be pretty sure that for 3 months the result is valid. If you go for 6 months, it might be even enough, but I think for 3 months it's quite valid to say, yes, there's no change in the antibody titer, and you can do gene therapy without doing another test against AAV5. So if we conclude out of the study, I think AAV-mediated gene therapies for hemophilia continue along the development pathway. For hemophilia A, the BioMarin product is licensed in the European Union and is on the market since 1 month in Germany. Reimbursement is still an issue, but at least it's on the market. It's now, or it could be in the next year, reality for patients. It's filed for the FDA, and I think it will be next year maybe available in the US too. And important is that, of course, for hemophilia A, you have a negative AAV test. And the choice of the vector AAV5, I think, was a good one, because AAV5 has not only the lowest prevalence of pre-existing immunity compared to other serotypes, it also have a low titer. Yeah? So the titer is quite low, and that means gene therapy might be successful even in patients with a low titer or middle titer with pre-existing antibodies. This trial from BioMarin is under the way. At the moment for hemophilia A, we can only use patients with a negative AAV test. And so this is the importance of the study, that patient selection for gene therapy is at the moment for hemophilia A, you need a negative result for this AAV test. And in the second part of my presentation, I want to share a little bit with you what we think in Germany, how gene therapy should be implemented and how we choose patients for gene therapy. I told you already, we are now, from now on, we are able to prescribe gene therapy in the real world outside the clinical trials. And we think, of course, there must be a selection of certain patients, and the patients must be at the center of decision making. So education and information is crucial. And for Germany, at least, we think we should provide equal opportunity to access gene therapy independently, where you are treated, in which part of the country, if you are treated in an expert center or in a different center. And of course, due to a lot of reasons, which I don't evaluate here so much, of course, gene therapy is not gene therapy, it's done and you are fine. There is some kind of lifelong follow-up to ensure long-term success. And in Germany, at least, and that might be different from the strategy in the US, we have hemophilia comprehensive care in a few centers. They are called hemophilia comprehensive care centers, and we have a lot of smaller regional hemophilia centers. And there will be in gene therapy, of course, a collaboration. So there will be a hub center where gene therapy is performed, and there will be a spoke center where the usual care of the patients will continue, and there will be a close collaboration between the hub and the spoke centers. So to give you an idea, in Germany, we have about 80 million inhabitants, and we have about 13 hemophilia comprehensive care centers who will be the hub centers and who will be qualified for gene therapy. And they are collaborating with about 80 smaller hemophilia centers. So information about gene therapy to all patients is important. And of course, we have the clinical trial inclusion criteria as a template for selection. And in the European license for gene therapy for hemophilia A, a negative antibody test against AAV is mandatory. So patients have to have severe hemophilia A, at least 18 years old, no pre-existing antibodies against AAV. That's so important because you can imagine that in Germany, according to our results of the seroprevalence study, 1 out of 3 patients, 30%, will not be eligible for gene therapy because they have existing antibodies against AAV5. Yeah. Second point is gene therapy is directed to the liver, so liver health is important. Patients shouldn't have active hepatitis or liver fibrosis. HIV is a matter of discussion. And in the trials, there were no patients included who had an inhibitor against factor VIII. Of course, there are a lot of other criteria, motivation and commitment, and gene therapy, there's still some uncertainty. But for this presentation, I think it's most important to start quite early to exclude patients with a positive AAV test. Because if you go through the whole process with a patient and say, okay, he's interested in gene therapy, and you explained everything, and just in the end, it turns out that he has antibodies against AAV5 and is not suitable, then there was a lot of expectation from the patient, and you cannot fulfill his tasks. So our approach is, if a patient is interested in gene therapy, we will do this AAV test right in the beginning to make sure that he is eligible. Otherwise, there's no need to start the process for gene therapy. And this test for neutralizing antibodies is required. In hemophilia B, a negative test is required. In hemophilia A, a negative test is required. In hemophilia B, I told you already, they are using, in the studies, they're using the same AAV5 vector, and they included patients with antibodies against AAV5 and recognize that if there is a titer below 1 to 700, then gene therapy is successful. And so for hemophilia A, the studies are ongoing, but it's still not finished. And evaluation of liver health, from my point of view, has the same importance to ensure that gene therapy will be successful. In Germany, at the moment, I can tell you why are we so interested in making gene therapy successful? Because the pricing in Germany at the moment is, for the gene therapy for hemophilia A, is 2 million euro for a patient. And of course, if you do such an expensive treatment, you want to ensure that it's successful. And if you treat a patient with antibodies against AAV and have no success, of course, you spend a lot of money for nothing. And that it's very important for the follow-up to look at these patients. Of course, we have to manage the patient expectations. You have to look at the current treatment that might be different. Hemophilia, luckily in the US and in Germany, is well treated with the existing products, especially hemophilia A, with long-acting factor concentrates and imidazumab. We can do a good prophylaxis to avoid any bleeding. With gene therapy family planning, of course, for the first 6 months, there's a shedding of the vector in the semen, so you shouldn't get kids in this time. Of course, the motivation and commitment for the follow-up, which is different from my topic now, but to keep in mind that for the first 6 months, there's a blood draw every week to look at the liver to avoid any kind of the rise in transaminases and to lose factor expression. So it's you have to invest something for gene therapy in order to get a good result. So patient eligibility is dominated from my point of view for hemophilia A mainly by the result of the AAV test. In the US and Germany, according to the seroprevalence study, 30% of the patients are antibody positive and at the moment cannot be treated with gene therapy. And of course, after gene therapy, you have very high titers of antibodies. And that's important to communicate to the patients too, because after one AAV gene therapy, there's not at the moment a second chance because the antibody titers are very high against the vectors and you cannot do gene therapy twice at the moment. So if you look at the patient journey, and that is nearly my last slide, of course, education and information is crucial about gene therapy, about the eligibility for gene therapy and the decision to treat. And of course, you have to compare and discuss with the patients the treatment modalities at the moment, the goals of the patient, and if gene therapy has additional value. So we treated in several different studies patients with gene therapy, and if gene therapy works, I still think it's a transforming treatment, because if gene therapy works, you are totally independent from treatment. Of course, you're not independent from medical care because you have to do regular controls, but you're independent from any kind of treatment. But in the beginning, you need quite a long-term follow-up. And the AAV testing in the beginning of this treatment cycle is crucial. What I think, and that might be from different countries, there might be different models. But in Germany, due to the collaboration between centers of high expertise, which are called the Hemophilia Comprehensive Care Centers, to patients, to centers with a lower expertise, the hemophilia treatment centers, I'm quite convinced that we can offer gene therapy at least to all patients who are interested. And first, the HTC will talk to the patients, raise any interest for gene therapy. We are at the moment establishing that the test against AAV antibodies is done in the local hemophilia center. If this test is negative, then you contact the dosing hemophilia comprehensive care centers. There will be a second conversation with the patients, the discussion about pros and cons of gene therapy, and then the infusion will be done at the dosing center, and the follow-up will be shared with a local center where you can perform the weekly blood draws, but on the supervision of the hemophilia treatment center in the middle. And that I think it's from my point of view, and this model was first introduced by the EHC, the European Hemophilia Consortium, and the European Association for Hemophilia and Allied Disorders. And at least for Germany, it makes a lot of sense to guarantee access to gene therapy for a lot of different patients. So to summarize, information is key. And I tried to give this information that the AAV test is necessary before gene therapy, because for the treatment, for the gene therapy for hemophilia A, we need a negative test results. And we can expect that in Germany and the US, 30% of our patients will have pre-existing antibodies, and at this stage are not not able to do gene therapy. Of course, you have to manage expectations with the patients, explore motivation and adherence, because in the beginning, for the first 6 months, daily blood draws are necessary. Cooperation between different centers is necessary. There might be a patient support program for this regular blood draws. And of course, to facilitate the collaboration, we need some digital solutions. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I explained to you why these seroprevalence studies were important and why this test is important for patients who want to go for gene therapy. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat whenever you're ready, or the Q&A, I'm sorry. So I've got a few for you already, but I'll start with this first one that just came into the chat. Given the cost of gene therapy in Germany, do you need government approval to get a patient on gene therapy? And they say thank you.
Yeah, so the system in Germany is quite different from the US. So in Germany, we have at the moment 97 different insurance companies where you can get health insured. And if at the moment, if I want to do gene therapy, I have to inform the insurance company of the patient and ask them if they cover the costs. Because at the moment, there's no contract between the company and the insurance company. If we look in the future, so after 1 year, there will be a fixed price and there will be contracts between insurance companies and the manufacturer, and then it's easier. But at the moment, I need not permission, but I need to negotiate with insurance companies that they cover the costs, not the government.
Great, thank you. Should patients start to ask for tests to see if they have pre-existing immunity against AAV5, or only if they are seriously considering pursuing gene therapy if or once it's approved in their country?
I think from my point of view, it makes only sense to do these tests if you have an interest in gene therapy, because otherwise this has no consequence for hemophilia at all. The problem is that at the moment, the test is a companion test for gene therapy. So you need this special test provided by the company BioMarine, doing in this one laboratory in the US or in one laboratory for Europe in Berlin, in Germany, with a negative test result. So of course you can do a different test in another laboratory to get an idea, but crucial for the reimbursement, at least in Germany, is this negative test from this specialized laboratory.
Great, thank you. As a physician researcher, what do you think is most important for patients and families to consider when it comes to gene therapy?
Yeah, I think it's very important that, first of all, gene therapy needs commitment, because it's not a one and done, and we need regular controls in the beginning, because if I explain it very simple is, of course, you use a viral vector. And the viral vector is still a virus, and the body over a long period in mankind try to avoid infections, they fight against infections. So it's very likely that the organism will fight against this infection and you have an immune reaction. So one immune reactions are the antibodies, and if you have antibodies, then you cannot do gene therapy. The second is a cellular immune response, so cells go against these viruses. And then you can get, of course, the liver cells who have the transgene in it will get destroyed by the immune system. And if this happens, there will be no factor expression. And if you miss this point, where the immune system destroys all the liver cells who have the factor VIII gene in it, then gene therapy was for nothing again. And that's the reason for this close surveillance, because if there is an immune reaction, you have to give steroids, immunosuppression, to avoid this reaction and preserve factor expression. And that is, from my point of view, is the most important part. So the first 6 months are the important months where you have to keep your liver healthy, no alcohol, no medication which has side effects for the liver, and regular surveillance. And if it works after the 6 months, controls will be less often, and then you will earn what you invested before.
Great, thank you. Let's see, were you surprised with the study results, or were they what you expected?
The results of the gene therapy trials or of the seroprevalence trial?
Seroprevalence.
Yeah, so we know we know a little bit before from the normal population that there was a seroprevalence which was always said about 50%. So at least for the US and Germany, I think it is positive to see only 30% seroprevalence. But for countries like South Africa, of course, it's a little bit disappointing that there's such a high seroprevalence.
Great, thank you. What research are you working on next?
Yeah, so we are participating in a lot of trials from different companies, and I think gene therapy, we are still participating in gene therapeutic trials, but in other trials, how to treat hemophilia with extended half-life, factor concentrate. I think in the hemophilia field, we have a lot of different opportunities in the future besides gene therapy to treat this disease much better than 25 years ago when I joined the field of hemophilia.
Great, thank you. So if you're following similar research in the US, what are the biggest differences in study approaches or results that you're seeing with similar research compared to that in Europe?
Yeah, I think so. Most of the studies which are done now are international. So there are patients recruited from the US, from Germany, from all countries in the world. So the approach is pretty similar now. The biggest difference is when it comes to the license of the products. There the systems are very different, and access to treatment might be completely different in the US from Germany. In Germany, we have quite a good situation because in Germany, every patient has health insurance, and health insurance covers for all kinds of hemophilia treatment, and prophylaxis is a treatment of choice for all patients with severe hemophilia. That is guaranteed by our government. So access to treatment after a licensed product, from my point of view, is much easier than in the US.
I think that's very fair. All right, so that was actually my last question for you. So I would just like to thank you again for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Is there anything else you would like to share with our viewers before we sign off?
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. I hope you understand the importance, and I still think gene therapy is a great opportunity, even with all hurdles which are still there. But I think it's a great opportunity for the patient community.
I agree. All right. Well, thank you for your time and expertise. I'd also like to thank each one of our viewers for joining us today. Please note that this recorded webinar will be available on Friday, October 28th at hemophilia.org under the events tab with all of our archived webinars. Also available in the events tab is our upcoming schedule for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thanks.